In this lesson, we're going to discuss trade agreements, and in particular, we'll discuss a little bit about one of the important agreements of the 20th and 21st century, the European Union. So, if you'll remember, trade agreements, they arise because countries are choosing to restrict trade, and a trade agreement essentially is a way to open up trade. So before World War II, countries used a variety of methods to restrict international trade. They would use embargoes, they would use tariffs, or they would use quotas. And these were discussed in a previous lesson. But across the world, countries had a wide variety of embargoes, tariffs, and quotas, and that really restricted global trade. And then World War II happened. And after World War II, the world pretty much realized this was a chance to reset things. And so one of the things that they established what was called the GATT, which is the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade. Essentially what GATT was it was a methodology that established some procedures for how the world's countries would begin working on reducing these trade restrictions, how they would open up trade. And it set forth a procedure for having rounds of discussions. And in these rounds of discussions, the countries would negotiate back and forth in terms of what they were willing to reduce in exchange for other countries. So, for example, there might have been a round of discussion that talked about agricultural trade restrictions, and one country may have said, we're willing to reduce our tariff on imported corn if that country over there reduces its tariff on imported sugar. And these countries went through these rounds of discussion in order to establish some trade agreements. And we have pretty much realized that even though we do have tariffs in existence today, they're nowhere near what it was like during World War II. Tariffs have fallen greatly, so that really only about 5% of the world's GDP falls under some sort of tariff. So the GATT worked really well, promoting a lot of discussion, and then from 1947 until about 1995, we went through several rounds of GATT discussion. And then we realized there needed to be some sort of organization which sort of monitored all of these trade agreements. And so GATT became what is now known as the World Trade Organization in 1995. And the World Trade Organization is an organization of over 150 member countries. They're continuing to have discussions like before, but the World Trade Organization is sort of the entity that mediates the trade disputes that countries may have. They may have agreed on something in a previous round of discussion, but for whatever reason, maybe the politicians are deciding to punish another country and they establish a tariff, and that other country says that's in violation of the agreement. And so it goes before the World Trade Organization, which sort of mediates those disputes. And each one of these rounds of GATT discussions has produced innumerable trade agreements, and the World Trade Organization essentially just monitors those. So those members in the WTO that are doing a very good job of establishing free trade, they have been granted what's known as most favored nation status. And essentially what that does is it says any country with most favored nation status sort of gets special preference, and even less restrictions when trading with other most favored nation countries. There are some exceptions that are made to countries that negotiate as a unit. For example, the European Union negotiates as a unit. It's a group of countries, and I'll discuss this in just a moment. So if you look at the map of the World Trade Organization, the areas in green are those countries that belong to the WTO. The areas in yellow are those that are desiring to become members of the WTO, and they're at various points in discussion to become part of the WTO. So you'll notice much of Northern Africa still does not belong to the World Trade Organization, as some countries in Asia, Central Asia, also do not belong to the WTO. There's another group of organizations that makes the news every now and then. It's not really a trade agreement per se, but these are organizations that coordinate economic activities between a variety of countries. So in 1975, the 6 strongest economies at that time got together and they created what was known as the G6. So the G6 consisted of France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the United States, and UK. And these 6 countries recognized that because they were the strongest economies at that time, they needed to coordinate their efforts. They needed to look at what was happening with trade between their countries, and they needed to coordinate what was happening in their economies because it affected so many other parts of the world. Well, very quickly thereafter, there was another country that sort of felt excluded. It was a very strong economy at the time, and in 1976, the G6 became the G7 by adding Canada. Canada was a very strong, stable economic partner to all of those that were already in the G6. Well, through the years, economies have grown and prospered, and so in 1998, the G7 added Russia and became the G8. So the Soviet Union had collapsed, and Russia was a very powerful economy at the time, and so it was believed that those 8 countries really controlled so much of the stability in the world's economy. So essentially in the G8, the heads of government get together and they coordinate what's happening in their countries in terms of economic activity. And they look at international trade and what's going on between those countries. Are there any problems? Are there any things that the economy needs to be loosened up with? Do sectors need to be promoted? Are there any trade restrictions that are hindering economic growth in those countries? And if they are, then they're probably impacting the rest of the world also. So those 8 countries consist of about 40% of the world's GDP. Interestingly, the G8 became the G7 several years ago because Russia invaded Ukraine, and the world pretty much did not like that behavior. Russia essentially was, they claimed not to have invaded Ukraine, but they supported the rebel movement in Ukraine, and they annexed the territory of Crimea. And the G7 essentially said, we're going to punish you strategically. We're just going to exclude you from any of this coordinated activity, and we're going to go back to having the G7. So interestingly, though, the G7 is going to be surpassed in terms of economic power by the largest emerging countries of the world. So the BRIC countries, Brazil, Russia, India, China, and then add to that Mexico, Indonesia, and Turkey. Those are the largest emerging countries, and those economies actually pretty soon will be larger than the G7. So in 2014, I mentioned the G8 was suspended, and we have gone back to having the G7 instead of the G8 because Russia was annexing Crimea, and the leaders decided to punish Russia for that behavior. Now there's also this thing called the G20, and these are the 20 most stable and major economies of the world. Add to that the European Union, which is not a country, but it's a group of countries. You do not need to memorize this list of countries, but if you just kind of get a feel for what types of countries are major economies these days, you'll see obviously some developed economies, the United States, France, Germany, Italy, UK, Australia. You'll see some emerging countries, India, even Mexico, Argentina is an emerging economy. These economies got together, and essentially their finance ministers are coordinating what's happening with their central banks in terms of interest rates and things that are being done to stimulate their individual economies, and they're investigating how they affect other countries' economies. So essentially the purpose of the G20 is really to promote financial stability across the world. And so now the G20 meets I believe it's every 8 weeks, but I'm not certain of that. But they will meet again to look at what's happening in each of those 20 economies in terms of their financial structure, their central bank, the government debt, what's going on in those 20 countries. Because whatever's happening in those 20 countries is probably having a very large impact on the rest of the world. Now there's a variety of other trading blocks and agreements that you may have heard about, you may not have heard about. For example, NAFTA is the North American Free Trade Agreement established in 1994 between Mexico, Canada, and the United States. It essentially removed barriers that were not tariffs. So any kind of restriction to trade that was not a tariff, it removed them. It established some environmental safeguards and practices within those countries. And truthfully, our GDP in the long run really wasn't impacted by the North American Free Trade Agreement. We realized eventually that jobs actually were created because there was more trade that was happening between these three countries. So yes, our country did lose jobs, but we also gained jobs as a result of NAFTA. One of the most common disagreements had to do with the labor market and different labor standards within those countries, in particular Mexico. And so they had to negotiate some different labor standards. So President Trump he said it was time for NAFTA to be renegotiated, and the NAFTA has been replaced with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Agreement, and this replaces NAFTA. They negotiated several different sectors that have been changing through time since 1994, in particular car manufacturing. Mexico and Canada both were producing a lot of parts and a lot of cars, and yet ultimately, and because of that, they really weren't counted. Even though the final product was made in the United States, much of the work was done in other countries. And so now they've agreed that if a car is going to be counted as a U.S. car, more of the parts need to be made within the United States. The Canadians agreed to open up their dairy market to the United States. The Canadians had not allowed dairy from the U.S. into Canada for many years, and the Canadians actually subsidized their industry. And so that was also renegotiated in terms of the dairy market. The United States made an agreement that they would not place a tariff on cars that are imported from Mexico or Canada, and that was part of the United States-Mexico-Canada agreement. The other thing that was added into this agreement, which was not added into NAFTA, was that it required the agreement to be revisited in 6 years. NAFTA was just set in place, but there was no thinking that it ever needed to be looked at again, without realizing that the economies change, and the U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement built that into the agreement, that they would sit down every 6 years and look at this agreement. There's also the Central American Free Trade Agreement with Dominican Republic. So essentially this is a free trade agreement between the United States and several Central American countries, along with the Dominican Republic. That's the DR part. Dominican Republic was added in 2009. Essentially, this agreement focuses on agriculture, and it reduces a lot of the agricultural tariffs between these countries, as well as tariffs that these countries had on the United States for things that we exported to them. And so it essentially opened up some trade in the Central American region. You may have heard about this thing called the TPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. This was an agreement between 11 countries. Again, I'm not going to ask you to memorize the list of countries, but I want you to recognize something about these countries. You'll notice Canada, United States, Mexico, and then several countries in South America, and then several countries in Southeast Asia. China is not a member of what was called the TPP. Part of the rationale had to do with the purpose for the TPP, which was to promote economic growth primarily in Southeast Asia, reduce poverty, and increase jobs in some of these areas. And part of this was to allow some of the more stable North American countries to help boost economic growth in some of these Southeast Asian countries so that they could better compete with China, which is a very dominant player in Asia. The United States, under President Trump, pulled out of the TPP, and those other 10 countries kept going. They now call it the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership. But essentially, this agreement is still this effort to promote economic growth in Southeast Asia and South America, relying on some of the more stable countries of the Pacific Rim. In an earlier lesson, you should have learned a little bit about the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. This is a grouping of countries that established in 1967. So if you know your history, we have Vietnam, we have a wide variety of discord and conflict in Southeast Asia at this time. But these countries got together and they recognized that if they could coordinate their economies they might be able to promote some economic growth and promote some peace in the region. So ASEAN was created among these countries, again, to really help boost stability in the Southeast Asian countries. Again, you do not need to know the list of these countries. You may have heard of some of them, Vietnam or Philippines or Indonesia. Some of them may be brand new. You may never have heard of them before. In South America, there's an agreement called the Mercosur Agreement, which is essentially a free trade agreement established in 1991 to start with among Argentina, Brazil, Paraguay, and Uruguay. And then they added, some other members have been added along the way. But essentially the purpose, again, of Mercosur was to open up some trade within these major countries of South America. And in particular, they also wanted to establish common external tariffs. So previously, Brazil might have had a tariff on meat from the United Kingdom, and yet Argentina might not have had a tariff on meat from Argentina. So then what might have happened was people in Argentina bought British beef, and then they resold it in Brazil and avoided those tariffs in Brazil. And so essentially what this did was it kind of coordinated the trading agreements between South America, the major countries in South America, and the rest of the world. There's also the Asian Pacific Economic Cooperation, which is another agreement that was made in 1989. And the APEC, you'll notice, consists of countries essentially that surround the Pacific Ocean. United States, Russia, Canada, some of the South American countries, some of the Southeast Asian countries. These countries essentially got together in 89 and again believed that they wanted to coordinate economic activity. They wanted to try to negotiate and keep trade open between these different countries. Coming back to APEC, you may have heard that the United States and China right now, they have a variety of tariffs back and forth with each other. APEC's goal was not to eliminate tariffs, but it was to coordinate the economic activity of what was happening. And so while the United States and China have these tariffs in place against each other's economy, it's not as though they have fallen out of membership in APEC. I want to discuss a little bit deeper detail about the European Union. The European Union is a collection of countries with about a quarter of the world's GDP. In many of the countries in the European Union, they use a common currency, which is called the euro. In the European Union, there is what's known as a common market. So that means there's free circulation of goods, services, and people, even within the European Union. So for example, if you consider, if in the United States we manufacture a product and we export it to another country, there's customs duties, there may be tariffs in place. Selling to other countries is actually sometimes pretty challenging. If you were a person who wanted to go to another country, you'd have to have a passport, you'd have to pass through customs, and it's rather complicated. In the European Union, however, in these countries, they got together and said, we're going to allow free circulation of goods and services and people. So what that means is if France produces a product, they can sell it in Germany and really not have to go through any of these complicated processes of trade with another country. It would almost be like if somebody produced something in Illinois and sold it in Kentucky. It's almost the same sort of mechanism. So the European Union started out after World War II as an agreement on trade between the coal and steel industries among 6 countries: France, West Germany, Italy, and the Benelux countries, Belgium, Netherlands, Luxembourg. So those 6 countries, you'll notice, pretty much make up the heart of the continent of Europe, and they were most impacted by World War II. A lot of destruction in World War II in those countries. So they agreed to open up trade in coal and steel. And then they realized that was going so well, they kept going further. And eventually, the Maastricht Treaty was signed in 1993, and that created the European Union. As part of that agreement, they established the euro. So a common currency was proposed for countries within the EU. They also proposed common EU citizenship. So what that means is you're a citizen of the country that you were born in, but you're also a citizen of the EU. And that means you can run for the EU Parliament. So what we have is an agreement among countries to coordinate their economies, to allow for free trade, free movement of people, and a common currency that's used in most of the EU countries. Not all EU countries use the euro. Well, in 1985, the European Economic Community, they had created this thing called the Schengen Agreement, and we'll hear about this later in the semester when we talk about migration. But the Schengen Agreement essentially is an agreement among many of these EU countries that essentially says if you can cross the border in any one of these countries, you can cross the border in any of them. And so, for example, my daughter went to Greece. She worked in Greece for a while. She was very excited to possibly get a Greek stamp on her passport. Well, her plane landed first in Paris. She got a French stamp on the passport because once she landed in Paris, she could have gone anywhere in the Schengen Agreement and she never had to show her passport again. And so what this allowed was really this free movement of people within the Schengen Agreement as part of this free trade agreement and the Maastricht Treaty of 1993. Well, in 2007, they recognized there were some problems with the Maastricht Treaty. They needed to simplify things, so they created the Treaty of Lisbon. But most importantly, they also established Article 50, which was a procedure to withdraw from the EU. Prior to 2007, they did not believe that any country would desire to withdraw from the EU, and so there was no mechanism to pull out of the EU. So in 2007, they created a mechanism to withdraw from the EU. This brings us to a current issue in the EU, that of Brexit. Brexit essentially is where Great Britain formally has withdrawn membership from the European Union. It's interesting that throughout the history of Great Britain, there have been other colonies that Great Britain had over the centuries, and they have withdrawn and gained independence from the UK. And now, I find it ironic, the UK is wanting independence from the EU. So what what does Brexit mean? What does it actually look like? How did it occur? Very simply, in 2016, British voters passed a referendum that granted the Parliament and the Prime Minister the authority to invoke Article 50. And Article 50 from the Lisbon Treaty essentially starts a 2-year timeline in which all of the agreements would be renegotiated and there would be a formal exit of the country from the European Union. So in 2017, Prime Minister May invoked Article 50, and from 2017 until 2020, the debate continued. There were several extensions that the EU granted Great Britain. Technically, the process should have completed itself before 2020, but it took up until December 31st of 2020 for Great Britain to officially withdraw from the European Union. So what were some of the issues and the sticking points that were part of the challenge for this withdrawal? One of them had to do with the idea of whether the withdrawal should be what's called a hard Brexit or a soft Brexit. Essentially, a hard Brexit was where Great Britain would essentially just tear up all the agreements and start over again. There would be no agreement in terms of allowing Great Britain to be part of the market, the common market for the EU. Any trade that would be done between Great Britain and the EU would require complete renegotiations of customs and tariffs and duties between Great Britain and the European Union. A soft Brexit would allow Great Britain to exit the European Union but still maintain trade with the EU as it was before. Ultimately, what ended up happening was a little bit leaning a little bit more towards the hard Brexit side, and Great Britain is now having to renegotiate a variety of trade agreements. Another issue that was a sticking point in the negotiations had to do with what would happen between Ireland and Northern Ireland. So in the island of Ireland, Northern Ireland actually falls under the purview of Great Britain. Ireland is its own country. They share the same island, but Northern Ireland falls under the government of Great Britain. Part of this has to do with the challenges that occurred through the 1960s up until the 1990s, and this was a time period known as the Troubles, in which Ireland and Northern Ireland in particular were trying to break free of Great Britain, and ultimately there were border checkpoints that were established between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Some of this conflict was religious in nature, in that Ireland is, by default, it is classified as a predominantly Catholic country, whereas Northern Ireland falls under Great Britain, which is primarily an Anglican. It falls under the English Anglican religion, and so that was one of the conflicts. Ultimately, borders were established in the 1960s. There were physical borders between these two countries, and it was very challenging because you actually had neighborhoods that were divided in two. In 1993, the Good Friday Accords were signed, which removed the physical border between Ireland and Northern Ireland. Well, now Ireland is part of the EU. Northern Ireland is under the government of Great Britain, which is no longer part of the EU. So there was question about what to do about the border. So what was called the Northern Ireland Protocol was signed, and it essentially meant that there would be no physical boundary on the ground. Essentially what it did was it moved the boundary for checking of customs to the ports. So essentially there's a sea boundary. So anything that's flowing into Northern Ireland is going to have to be inspected at the port of Belfast, and that is where the boundary is now going to occur. Another issue that was a real challenge for Great Britain's withdrawal from the EU had to do with citizenship and migration. If you'll remember, in the discussion about the EU, you have what's known as EU citizenship. So anybody who is born in any of the countries that were part of the EU have EU citizenship, and they can move around wherever they desire. Well, for decades, we had EU citizens living in Great Britain. Now that Great Britain has withdrawn from the EU, what happens with those EU citizens? Essentially what ended up happening was Great Britain allowed for a time period for the current EU citizens to obtain Great Britain citizenship of Great Britain. The problem was that before all of this, in 2017 to 2020, you had a mass number of individuals leaving the EU trying to get into Great Britain. And actually the hope was that from Great Britain they could either gain citizenship in Great Britain or even move from Great Britain possibly into the United States, or possibly into Canada. And so there were mass numbers of individuals. They had been migrating for years, maybe from the Middle East, maybe from Eastern Europe, trying to get into Great Britain, and have been trying to work their way into a more stable citizenship route. As part of the final results, Great Britain allowed for some of these EU citizens to gain citizenship in Great Britain. However, there is a deadline in which that will no longer be an option. So Great Britain has had to deal with a variety of issues, and on December 31st of 2020, the process was officially completed, and now Great Britain is having to work its way through a variety of trade agreements with countries of the EU as well as any other country in the world that it desires to trade with. Great Britain has already established some trade agreements with the United States, as well as Canada, and is working on trade agreements with several South American countries. One of the other major problems that the EU countries have had has to do with the debt of the individual countries. In particular, Greece, Ireland, and Portugal were accumulating extremely large debts. The way they were running their governments, they were accumulating very large debts. Greece in particular was getting ready to default on its loans. And so that would create a crisis. And essentially, what ended up happening in Greece several times, in Ireland and Portugal, they were able to avert this crisis. But Greece in particular had to enact what were called austerity measures. So essentially in Greece, they had to take their government budget and trim it dramatically. They also needed to agree that they would do some things to promote stability and growth. In particular, they would make sure that their government debt was no larger than 60% of their GDP. The problem, however, is they're not there yet. And so the more stable countries of the EU have been bailing out some of these other countries in the EU that are not as stable, and the more stable countries are starting to resent the fact that they're carrying the load for some of the things that are being done in these other countries. And so that's one issue that they're having to deal with. Another issue I mentioned previously was the Ukraine. So that was where Russia has annexed part of the Ukraine and essentially claimed that land for Russia. And the EU has said, you know, we're done fighting wars over land. And that really is not the way that we do things in the 21st century. Another issue that they're having to deal with is migration and immigration from other countries. So the EU is very stable. There's a lot of strong economies among those member countries, and there are people that desire to move to those countries. So if you look at this map, again, you do not need to memorize numbers or memorize names of countries, but just geographically you will see that there are a lot of immigrants that are coming from Syria in particular, that are coming from Afghanistan, Pakistan, the Middle East. They're wanting to get into the European Union. There's a lot of instability in northern Africa, and they're wanting to get into Spain. Again, remember the Schengen Agreement. Once you're in the EU, then you can go anywhere in the EU. So if you can make it from Libya to Spain, then you can easily make it to Germany and possibly even Great Britain, if you could figure out who could sponsor you as an immigrant in Great Britain. So this is a photo that illustrates the seriousness of migration into the EU. This is a photo of the border in France. These are individuals that had come from the Middle East. They landed in Greece. They made their way across the EU. They made their way to France. And now they're wanting to cross the English Channel and get into Great Britain. And the French troops are trying to figure out, well, how do we manage this? So these three issues are huge issues for the European Union. So in this chapter, what we have discussed, we've discussed trade agreements and just kind of listed a little bit of the history of some of the major trade agreements. We also discussed a little bit of the history of the European Union. Now the textbook goes into a little bit more of the math, the finance of these agreements, and I'm not going to have you worry about those aspects. I just want you to kind of have a general sense of Why do we need trade agreements? And what are some of the big issues in the European Union?